Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. Last weekend I finally managed to get around to watching the mini-series Chernobyl, based on the nuclear accident in the Soviet Union in 1986, which is totally gripping viewing. And it resonates for me because I was actually in Sweden in late August of 1986, and the significance is the world first learned about the catastrophe because Sweden was the first country that detected what was going on. Well, detected what was going on outside the Soviet Union. So imagine that. The radiation alarms at a Swedish nuclear reactor 600 kilometers away from Chernobyl started going off. And after ruling out a radiation leak in their own reactor, the Swedes started searching for where all of this radiation was coming from. And they and other countries quickly narrowed it down to Chernobyl. The rest is kind of history. The Soviets at that stage, they tried to conceal everything, but finally they had no choice to admit that an accident had happened. But of course, for a long time they downplayed its severity. I hear you wondering, where am I going with this? The point isn't about the civil use of nuclear energy and safety. I'm agnostic on that issue. The point isn't even about nuclear-powered submarines, because in the Western world at least, the operation of submarine reactors shows that they are extremely safe. I will say, however, that decommissioning them at the end of their lives is a complete nightmare, which countries like the UK and Russia have not solved. And even the leader, the US, hasn't come up with a truly viable long-term storage strategy. That's a side issue. But I'm not even talking about that. For me, one of the most powerful messages of the series was how destructive a culture of secrecy is. There were many elements to the disaster, including several features of the reactor that were kept secret from the operators, and that was basically because of the nature of the Soviet Union itself. And for the accident itself, and I really do encourage people to watch the program, even though at times it's very harrowing, people who've been terribly injured in the accident and people's abandoned pets being shot and all of that sort of distressing stuff, very true to life, I have to say. Many aspects of what was taking place revolved around vital information not being communicated. When the accident occurred, even more secrecy hampered efforts to deal with it because information about its severity was suppressed. Some of the first people on the scene were a group of brave firemen who literally went to their deaths because they were told they were putting out a conventional fire on the roof of the building, not that they were close to an exposed reactor core that was emitting so much radiation going near it was a death sentence. No less a figure than the former leader of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev, said the disaster, more than any other single event, led to the collapse of the Soviet Union 3 years later. And this is because many people finally realized that they had been repeatedly lied to pretty much throughout their entire lives. They were suddenly confronted with the horrible reality that the country did not have the safest and most competent nuclear power sector in the world. The accident was a genuine catastrophe, costing an enormous amount of money and probably around about 10,000 extra deaths because of cancers, and was a demonstration not of strength, but of massive official neglect and stupidity that only saw the light of day in a disaster of such magnitude that it could no longer be hidden. Now, fast forward to today. Am I comparing Australia with the Soviet Union? Most definitely not. However, when it comes to official management of information connected with defence, I'm sorry to say that we are becoming increasingly Soviet-like. Now, just hang on, that's not hyperbole. I'm going to explain in some detail. It's been a hang-up of mine, as regular listeners might know. I've touched on ridiculous levels of secrecy around the thing, the current goat rodeo, better known as the General Purpose Frigate Project, and a few months ago, the disgraceful secret destruction and burying of the Taipan helicopter fleet. That's right, Army and the department were hoping to get away with this until I came across the story in mid-December. That proved too late to stop this stupidity, but hopefully has been early enough so that someone is eventually held to account. The situation in Australia is far worse than it was 20 years ago, and I have watched the gradual deterioration in conditions to a situation where now the Department of Defence no longer even bothers answering the most simple, straightforward questions from journalists. Or, to be fair, questions, they always have to be submitted in writing. They are farmed out within the department. Undoubtedly, answers are produced by well-meaning ADF personnel and defence staff, but then that information is suppressed either at a higher level in the bureaucracy or in the offices of Ministers Miles and Conroy. We now live in an environment where the only official information is the equivalent of production quotas being exceeded and happy, healthy workers who are the envy of the world. You know, the sort of stuff that you get on North Korean state television and what used to be the norm in the USSR in the lead-up to Chernobyl. Happily, there is an alternative, and it was on display last week at the Air Power Conference here in Canberra, where US military people showed how things could and should work. And incidentally, I wasn't even going to attend the conference because there was no online registration available for journalists. And I thought, well, if your intention is to exclude the media, I've got plenty of other things to get on with in my life. However, I and several of my colleagues were actually invited by the US Embassy, and we thank you for that, who helpfully emailed out links and encouraged us to attend. This was a level of helpfulness that our own RAF and Defence seemed incapable of coming up with. Anyway, at the conference there were a number of people from the United States, including two very senior military figures who, after their presentations, held separate media briefings for we Australian journalists. The first was US Air Force General James Hacker. He is the most senior USAF officer serving in Europe. He's responsible for the air and missile defence of 32 NATO alliance member nations. He also takes the lead for activities supporting Ukraine. And, for example, he was able to provide us with a lot of information about the role of Australia's E-7C Wedgetail, airborne early warning and control aircraft, which was deployed there for 6 months. Next day, he was followed by General Chance Saltzman. Chance is his name, not the gambling chance thing. He is the US Space Force's most senior military officer, and I have to say, he was looking very smart in the new Space Force tunic. He's a member of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he briefed us about enhancing the US-Australian partnership in space activities, and also just a bit of background about the foundation of the US Space Force. Now, they're obviously very busy people, but both Generals Hacker and Saltzman were very happy to give up about an hour of their time each for questions and discussions with a group of Australian journalists. And I'll have a lot more reporting in due course about what they had to say. There's simply too much information for me to get out right now. Compare that with zero engagement from the Australians. Absolutely none. Not a single officer was interested in giving us a briefing. No one was prepared to help. I have to make particular mention, very sadly, of the outgoing Chief of Defence Force Staff, Angus Campbell, because he gave one of his final public speeches. When he finished, he stalked out of the conference and was pursued by a gaggle of journalists trying to shove microphones in his face to ask questions about the Seahawk helicopter incident and Chinese flares that occurred a few days ago. For me, and I think for most people, this is a terrible look. The message that he was sending to all of the defence personnel who could see what was going on, the message was, just by his behaviour, the media are the enemy and the media are to be treated with contempt. Why do that? It's a mystery for me. Why not do what the US did with their people, go to a conference room and answer perfectly reasonable questions from reporters for a few minutes, rather than making everyone look bad by rushing off and sort of shoving people out of the way while, trying to get to your limo as quickly as possible. I know, or perhaps say knew, General Campbell moderately well, but he has withdrawn from any direct media engagement in the last few years. I don't know why. It's entirely possible that he could be complying simply with a government directive to behave like this. Anyway, I didn't actually see his speech at the conference, but there's been a lot of reporting of it, and I understand he defended AUKUS with quite a lot of emotion. And here I take very strong exception to the notion that he propagated that acquiring nuclear-powered submarines is like the Snowy Mountains scheme or building the Sydney Harbour Bridge, with a direct appeal to Australian patriotism. The activity isn't like the Snowy Mountains scheme or the Sydney Harbour Bridge, because, it's a false equivalent. For starters, those nation-building activities were easy to understand and benefited, if not the entire country, then a significant section of the population. The Sydney Harbour Bridge was clearly connecting two sides of the city. The Snowy Mountain scheme was about generating electricity. Now, these events at the time were completely open and transparent. Everyone knew what was going on. If you wanted to find details, you'd just contact the authorities. Now, with the nuclear-powered submarines, it is the total opposite, where in this country, everything is actually being hidden from sight. And in essence, all that we're being told about the purchase of Virginia-class submarines in the 2030s is that they are amazing and that the British-designed submarine will be a wonderful thing. Now, if I had to draft CDF's speech, I would have put a big red cross through all that stuff about the Sydney Harbour Bridge and Snowy Mountains, because, again, they were totally open and transparent projects taking place in full public view, and they cannot be compared in the slightest with the secrecy and deviousness surrounding the process about nuclear-powered submarines. In the interests of transparency, and in the very unlikely event that General Campbell or any of his staff or anyone in the Navy is listening to this podcast, or any minister, I've got a myriad questions, but here are just a few. Why are nuclear-powered submarines essential to the defence of Australia when 2 years ago a conventional submarine was fine? We were all told that we were developing a regionally superior conventional submarine. If the answer to that, in whole or part, has something to do with long transit times, well, why do we need to carry out extended operations in the South China Sea? And if we do, why not have refuelling stops for conventional submarines in northern Australia? Then why are we getting second-hand Virginia submarines, not new ones? Why are we handing over $4.7 billion to massively profitable US companies? How will the submarines be crewed when the ADF is actually declining in numbers? Why were French nuclear-powered submarines fueled with low-enriched uranium not studied in detail? I have a list of about another 100 questions, but that will do, I hope, to illustrate the point. We are being told nothing about what is going on other than these appeals to patriotism, and we're told over and over again that, for example, in the United States, there's bipartisan support for this deal. Well, that bipartisan support is likely to be, will evaporate in the future, should Donald Trump be elected the next president of the United States. And there's the further point. If there's bipartisan support for a thoroughly bad idea, it doesn't change the fact that it's a thoroughly bad idea. To compare what is going on with the Snowy Mountains scheme and all of that sort of thing is the sort of falsely patriotic nonsense that really troubles me. Because rather than analyze the need for nuclear-powered submarines, all we get is this appeal to raw emotion, and that's a worry because it indicates to me just how flimsy the actual justification must be. By the way, I've had people in the defence ecosystem contacting me with polite suggestions that I stop questioning AUKUS because it's the duty of all Australians to get behind it. No, it isn't. It's especially not the role of the media to act as government stenographers, even more so in circumstances when the government insists on treating us like dirt. Now, I'm well aware that all of this stuff about secrecy will not affect 90% of Australians. I suspect they neither know nor care that Australia keeps dropping down the list of government transparency, and I think we're now somewhere, 30th on the list or something like that. That's fine when everything is going well. Now, that's just like in the USSR, where people were fed this steady diet of annual production quotas always being exceeded and crime being unknown because people were living in a socialist paradise, and they were told they were far, far better off than people in the evil capitalist West. For defence, we are being fed a constant diet of how spending is increasing. It isn't. That the major beneficiaries of this imaginary increase are Australian companies. They aren't. And that there are zero impediments to Australia acquiring and then building nuclear-powered submarines. And as regular listeners know, there are a number of major obstacles, but that is not what we are being told. Now, cracks in the system are emerging. We couldn't send a ship to the Red Sea in December, I suspect because we didn't have one that was available. For the next 5 years, the surface fleet shrinks in numbers. Rather than receiving all of our 72 F-35s by the end of 2023, the final 9 are sitting in the US and no one knows when they will be delivered. By the way, I've reported on that. People shouldn't be too alarmed. But the government and defence simply will not even acknowledge that there is a delay. The government and the Department and Navy lied for about 6 months, pretending our donation to US shipbuilders was $3 billion, not the exchange rate adjusted $4.6 billion. 45 perfectly good Taipan helicopters were destroyed in secret because the Army and the government knew there would be a massive outcry if their plans were revealed in advance. What other country would do that? What country would deal with the issue of alleged poor availability by destroying $1 billion worth of helicopters and at the same time deny Ukraine their use? To fund the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines, the number of infantry fighting vehicles for the Army has been slashed, the number of self-propelled howitzers has been cut in half, our maritime mine warfare capabilities have been gutted, the Air 6500 series of air defence projects looks to have been scaled back. And despite this rather grim reality, we are expected to believe that things have never been better. That's fine. People can delude themselves until there's a crisis, and that is my main concern. And I really wonder how the Australian public will react if there is a dramatic change in regional circumstances and people realise that for the last 20 years they have been fed a diet, of bullshit, and it's only getting worse. Sorry for this rant. You can tell that I feel extremely strongly about this. I was particularly triggered by the CDF's appeal to patriotism to back AUKUS. I think what we need is a focused, realistic debate that features facts and reason and logic, and not just an appeal to nationalism. And a final message to people who think that ever greater levels of secrecy are necessary. You might be protecting your own career, but you are helping to destroy this country. So have a think about that. Okay, thank you for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia-Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.